My name is Jordan and I'm a PhD student at Newcastle University. And I'm going to be talking briefly today about the reception of two passages in Herodotus' histories that in the early to mid 19th century were turned into a recipe for a figgy pudding, a dish traditionally served in Britain for Christmas dessert and demanded by carolers in the song "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." This year, rather than a festive figgy pudding, I'm talking instead about the Herodotus pudding. In Herodotus pudding, we have one of the most tangible of all the receptions of Herodotus in the 19th century. It was a reception that required no pre-existing understanding. It was made not to be looked at or engaged with through reading, but to be enjoyed over the dining table. The recipe for Herodotus pudding gained prominence in cookbooks and cafes from the 1840s onwards, and was published well into the 20th century in the UK and also in America. The recipe takes its inspiration from Herodotus 239 to 240 and offers a stylized version of the meal produced preceding the Egyptian sacrifice of unblemished bulls to Apis. As Herodotus reports, once the animal has been sacrificed and prepared, the body is then filled with purified loaves, honey, raisins, figs, frankincense, myrrh, and other perfume spices, and they will burn it while pouring over it huge quantities of oil. They, being the Egyptians, fast before performing the sacrifice, and everyone beats their breast in grief, and the entrails are being burned. Once they have finished grieving, they serve up the remaining bits of the entrails as a meal, and that's the passage that's on the screen now. This description and the ingredients mentioned in it are then altered and transformed into the recipe for Herodotus pudding, which is essentially a variant of a traditional British steamed pudding. There are several variations of the recipe printed over the course of the 19th century, the first of which appears in Eliza Acton's Modern Cookery, published in 1845. That is that recipe there. And it comes with the subtitle, "Genuine Classical Receipt." There's a number of necessary substitutes, as one might expect, including the replacing of Herodotus' sacrificial bull for beef suet, loaves for breadcrumbs, honey for sugar, wine for sherry, and frankincense, myrrh, and perfume spices for lemon. It's worth noting that the recipe is not static throughout the 19th century, and in other variants, Herodotus' perfume spices are replaced with allspice or nutmeg. In Acton's accompanying notes, she states that the only variations she's made are sugar for honey and sherry for the wine of ancient Greece. The use of wine relates specifically to the sacrifice of the Apis bull at 239, when wine is said to have been sprinkled over the bull while it's at the altar pre-sacrifice. As well as this, Acton by her own admission says she hasn't made the recipe herself, and instead that we are indebted for it to an undisclosed accomplished scholar, and that it is really to be found in Herodotus. Despite the insistence upon it being in the histories, neither Acton nor any of the other recipes that are printed in the 19th century give any further context or information about where it came from within the histories itself. Though later publications, particularly its appearance in the Daily Mail in 1926, feature alongside the printing of the recipe comments on Greek culture. And they also begin to ask whether which wine the Greeks would have consumed and whether modern sherry would have been a suitable substitute. And this potentially suggests some lack of understanding on behalf of its audience and the precise origins of the dish in the histories, given that Herodotus here is describing an Egyptian festival and not a Greek one, and so presumably the wine would not have been Greek in the first place. But perhaps the most famous and the best circulated version of Herodotus pudding is the one found in Mrs. Beeton's book of Household Management, which by the late 1860s had sold upwards of 2 million copies. This is the recipe here. Beeton's recipe has breadcrumbs, figs, suet, salt, eggs, and nutmeg, and is served with wine sauce, and is incidentally the only version that I've found so far which contains the wine mentioned in Herodotus. The others contain either sherry as an Acton or brandy, which is more traditional in a Christmas pudding. And this same incarnation is still found in the editions of Mrs. Beeton's book of Household Management that are in print today, if anybody would like to have a go at making a copy. The lack of context provided in these recipes is perhaps a result of its academic origins, as stated by Acton. Some of the earliest references to Herodotus pudding come from the Oxford colleges, the earliest of which comes from Brasenose. And though it's unclear for how long Herodotus pudding was prepared at Brasenose, we know that at some time in the 20th century it seems to have been lost. It was rediscovered when a descendant of a former pupil who had studied there in the 1840s found a handwritten copy and returned it. This was then used as part of their quincentenary celebrations and was celebrated as the survival of just one recipe from Brasenose from 1846. It's also referenced in the sale of a commemorative pudding basin that was done for those same ceremonies, which featured a shield of the college and the line around the rim, Herodotus Pudding 1846. Another Oxford link is given by a former pupil of University College named Augustus C. Hare. Hare describes the summer of 1857 while staying with a friend, he was taken to dinner at Oriel College and was served Herodotus pudding, which he describes as being peculiar to that college. And whilst we know that Herodotus pudding was not only served at Oriel, we can reasonably infer that Hare had not experienced it at his own time at Oxford, and so it wasn't widespread amongst the colleges. It was, however, served at least until the 20th century, and by 1917 it was also included on the menu at Magdalen. And while the recipe for Herodotus pudding was relatively well published in the 19th century and appears in sources ranging from cookbooks and household manuals to newspapers and magazines, it also features in diary entries and in memoirs such as those by Hare. It did extend beyond print. And according to a 1909 restaurant management handbook, it was also sold in at least one popular riverside restaurant in London, and it was priced at 6p per portion, which is roughly about £7.20 if you were going to buy it today. And the evidence for Herodotus pudding on sale in at least one London restaurant suggests that there was a level of commercial interest and that it was perhaps reasonably well known. To conclude, it seems Herodotus pudding was created as something of an academic joke to perhaps be served at a high table. But how an isolated chapter from the histories went from a meal to entertain classically educated scholars to a recipe published in some of the best-selling household manuals of their day and onto the menus of restaurants for such a long period of time tells us something of the popularity of Herodotus in the 19th century and beyond, and of the adaptability of the histories into something even as surprising as a figgy pudding. Thank you.